recently finished building this new dining table for my parents, and in this video it's about making the live edge tabletop with the curved joinery. The cool thing about this is I basically only made this with handheld power tools and a few jigs. Not a single stationary tool was used, just handheld power tools and jigs. Most of that was the router. So let's get started.
The raw material for this tabletop were 2 slabs of cherry and 1 slab of maple rough sawn from the sawmill. Since these slabs are very big and heavy, I can't use my table saw or any other stationary tool. And because my current circular saw was way too small for this, I asked Bosch to help me out with this project. They gave me a bigger, very powerful circular saw that works with their track system, plus 2 tracks and a piece to join the tracks together. With that, it was easy to make the slabs more manageable.
These are the 3 slabs for the tabletop, which we just cut to rough length. And they are cherry, maple and cherry. And both the cherry slabs will be joined together with this maple with some curved joints. Before starting with this curved joint, I have to prepare the slabs, which means flattening one side at least and cutting out the defects of the wood. Fortunately, this slab has no defects on the side, which you will see, one little knot on the back side. The slab of maple is perfect all the way through, but unfortunately this slab has a big knot with a crack, another little crack and a third little crack. But the back side of this unfortunately is in really bad shape. There are cracks all along the slab. Since it is the center of the tree, there's actually a little bit of the pith inside. That needs to be removed altogether. The only good and logical solution is to cut this whole defect section out and glue the slab back together. That's not exactly how we wanted the tabletop to be, but we have to work with what we got and make the best out of it. Actually, this was the only cherry slab that was available in this size, so we were actually lucky to get this at all.
Here you can see the saw when it's used with the tracks. I was expecting the wood to pinch onto the saw blade because of stress in it, so right after the blade made a full cut, I put a wedge into the cut line to prevent that. Then my dad and I prepared the basement for the flattening jig by setting up a big tarp to contain the wood chips. You will see later. On that I could then assemble my flattening jig. In the building video of the jig I showed in detail how to set it up, so now I go over that really quickly. I tied 2 strings across the beams where the slabs will sit on. I raised the upper string by about 1 string thickness with 2 drill bits, and when the 2 strings just touch at the intersection, then the jig is set up flat. I can achieve that with the leveling feet. Next I made a gauge from scrap plywood that I used to set the side rails to the exact same height at all 4 mounting positions. That ensures that the rails are parallel to the beams that I just leveled with the strings. Then the jig is ready to use.
I shimmed up the first slab and put 2 wedges on 2 corners to compensate the twist and make sure it won't rock anymore. And then I fixed it in place by putting a clamp right here and here, and then clamping the clamps together with another clamp, and this holds it in place. As I said in the video of making this jig, some things you will figure out when you use them, and I think this is a pretty clever way.
And now let the chips fly and start flattening. The bit I'm using here has a 30mm diameter.
Pretty straight slab to begin with. I only cut 2 to 3 millimeters deep, and only this section was not cut, but that will be cut off when I remove the section where all the cracks are. Everything else is now nice and flat. The slab is now cut in half and flattened on one side. Next is to cut out the defects and glue it back together again. The ripping went totally fine if you ignore that I cut into my workbench. Oops. But the pieces don't quite fit yet. I don't know exactly what caused this. The track is straight, I checked that. Maybe it's stress in the wood that got released, or it's just a problem with this scale of wood. Anyways, let's deal with that and fix that.
The tracks are really straight and I used their back edge as a straight guide for my router. With the big router bit I then made a really shallow full depth pass. All of that worked really well.
There's nothing else that I can do to prepare these edges better for gluing other than maybe hand planing. The fit is a lot better than before. There's still a little bit of a gap in the middle, maybe half a millimeter, but clamps will take care of that.
To increase the strength of the glue joint, I routed slots for some floating tenons. They also align the pieces nicely. Clamping this wasn't as straightforward as you might think, because I didn't want to damage the live edge of the slab. So I put some pieces of cloth between the clamping jaw and the wood wherever it was necessary to spread the clamping force.
One little place doesn't have a continuous glue drip. That's okay. Pretty good glue up.
While that dries, I could flatten the other slabs. At this point I also made myself a nice little depth gauge that made shimming the slabs on the jig and deal with their twist a lot simpler.
As you can see, this slab has a little bit of a twist in it. It's cutting only on this side, through the center to this side.
As I'm cutting deeper, I remove more and more of the twist, but just enough to keep as much thickness as possible. The amount I removed per pass were about 3 millimeters.
I will now flatten the glue together slab again, since there are still a few rough sections, because I left it as thick as possible for as long as possible.
And once all slabs had one flat side, I flipped them around and milled the other side parallel to that. After that we brought the slabs upstairs to get a better look at all of them at once and decide how the curved joint should be. I had a few ideas for the curves, actually just random splines that I draw on the computer, but then I had a much better idea. The cherry slabs both had a really visible grain line at good spots that would give us the size tabletop we are looking for. So why not just use the already existing curve pattern from nature as the joint?
I'm now marking with a pencil along this grain line. This also has the advantage that this little last section of the pith will be cut out.
I then cut along the whole line with the jigsaw, and it's 45mm thick hardwood here. That took some time. As you can see, the tripod also gets tired of that and starts sinking down.
I now have this sitting on a piece of template material and now can transfer the shape of the grain to that.
The template material, this black stuff, is some phenolic resin coated birch plywood. Next, I cut out the template really carefully. The edge of the template has to be perfectly smooth, so I stick some sandpaper to a thin scrap piece of wood and sanded the whole edge.
This edge is now smooth along the whole length, and that's very important because this now is my master template and I'll use it to make the other two templates that I will then use on my workpieces. For making all of these curved joints, I use this router bit set, and the smallest one is for making the templates.
At first I needed to stick the master templates to some more template material. Then I cut through the full thickness with that small flush trim bit. Here it's crucial to never lose contact with the master template. That's why there's only one camera angle. I had to do this in one go without interruption.
Now that I have my templates, I now need to join this piece to this piece. To achieve that joint, I'll use this router bit from the set on the first piece together with the first template, and on the second piece with this bit from the set with the offcut piece of the template, which is the second template. Before routing though, I have to prepare this piece with the jigsaw so that the shape almost already matches the template. This bit will cut at an offset, so I make my mark also at an offset with the old washer trick.
Then it's quite simple. Sticking the template on really good and just flush trim along the edge.
Now that worked beautifully. Now if everything went fine, this template should fit the cut surface I just created perfectly. And it really does. That's so cool.
Since my material is so much thicker than what this router bit was meant for, I had to flush trim the rest with a normal flush trim bit and the now existing edge as the guide. Then the other slab with the other template and the normal flush trim bit. Again, I couldn't cut the full thickness in one pass, so I had to come back to finish the cut.
And now the moment of truth. Does it actually fit? The maple slab is a little bit thicker. Okay, it does fit, but it's not 100% perfect. In the middle again, there is a little bit of a gap. Clamping force again can close that gap. The problem is I don't have enough of these really big clamps, and the third slab, I don't have a single clamp that would be long enough for this width. So I have to come up with a gluing strategy.
Before that though, I also made some mortises for floating tenons, which I glued in place first so I don't have to deal with them during the bigger glue up.
For the gluing strategy, I decided to glue lots of blocks to the pieces, and they then provide a clamping surface for my smaller clamps. I do that on both sides so I get even tension from both sides of the slabs. This will probably be a pain to remove all these blocks again, but I don't see any other good solution. This is how the dry assembly looks at the moment. For now, just 3 clamps on top and bottom. It sits on those boards so that I have access to the lower clamps. Everything looks good for now. The joint is fully closed and the 2 boards are very flat. I'll also clamp these boards to the whole board to keep it flat, hopefully. But yeah, that should work. Plan changes, I moved everything to the flattening jig because my workbench is not that flat, and here I know the jig is flat and I can clamp everything to the jig, and this should ensure it will come out as flat as it can be.
The cool thing about gluing such a curved joint is that nothing really slides or shifts during the glue up, because there's only one position where the pieces really fit together.
Glue is squeezing out everywhere, that's a really good sign, so I think this is a successful glue up. It's out of the clamps, everything holds together. It's also very flat, it's rocking a little bit, but that's about half a millimeter out of flat, and for a piece that size, after this glue up, That I think is really good. And as you can see, there was a continuous glue squeeze out. That means that is a good glue joint.
And now repeat. Marking, then cutting, and then cutting, and more cutting.
We now brought all the slabs together to define the final size of the tabletop, like it's lying now. And now we are 1 meter at the widest section and about 88 centimeters at the narrowest section. That now tells me where the joint needs to be.
Again, it's not really difficult to make these joints. As long as you make really good templates, it will work. At this scale, it just takes a lot of time.
After routing, it's back on the flattening jig because it fits nowhere else anymore. And the joint is actually better than the first one. The gap is a lot smaller. Next is then to cut the mortises for the floating tenons, then gluing on the blocks and clamping it together. Once again, with the clamp in the middle, the gap is closed. For the second glue up to easier and faster find the correct position of the joint, I drilled a hole when it was dry assembled and clamped, and now I can stick a drill bit in there, and that gives me the absolute right position.
At the end, that drill bit wasn't really necessary. It worked without it. As I said, removing the blocks again was a little bit of a pain, but also fun to destroy all of them. And only one of them was basically a big knot that I had to drill away.
I removed the top from the jig for a moment to recheck if the jig setting is still correct. So I tied the strings there again, and they are still as exact as in the beginning. But I had to do some small adjustments to the side guides to make sure these are all equal distant again. So now the jig is again set up to flatten this beauty of a tabletop.
I already flipped the top after the first pass to make both faces flat. That way it sits perfectly on the jig and I don't have to shim out any of the twist or rocking anymore. Then I just flattened both sides until the router cut continuously over the whole surface.
I don't know about you, but I'd say this looks awesome. Before moving on with the tabletop, I have to clean this here a little bit. But that shouldn't take more than 5 minutes. It's relatively clean again in here, and I can go on with filling all the voids and defects with some resin. But there's one spot here that I also need to prepare.
A small mistake that now looks like a crack is on the underside, but for filling it with resin I have to tape the edge so the resin won't flow out.
To get the right 2:1 mixing ratio of the resin, I just use a kitchen scale. And some dark sanding dust. Doesn't really matter because no one will ever see the underside of this table. But that's just for experimentation, if that's a good color, so I can use it as well on the top side.
I hope it's okay that I didn't record the 3 minutes of mixing. The color that the resin got through that sawdust also looks pretty good. Unfortunately, most of the filling is on the underside. Nobody will ever see it, but still, it looks pretty good.
Tomorrow I can do the other side.
And like everyone does, I pop the bubbles with a lighter or, well, a torch.
This resin claims to cure in about 12 hours, but after 12 hours it still felt a little tacky, so I let it cure a little bit longer and started working on the base. And long story short, it now cured for more than 1 week, and I think it's dry by now. That means I now can go on and cut the table to its final size.
Since there isn't something like square on a live edge table, I just cut where it looked the best.
I'll do the sanding on the floor because the belt sander has so much pull. I would need a really stable table to sand this tabletop on, and since I don't have it, it only really makes sense to do that on the floor.
First, I removed the excess resin with a hand plane. Next, making pencil marks to sand away. That gives you a very good orientation on where you've already sanded and makes you sand everything evenly. I started with a 40 grit belt at about 45 degree to the grain. The next pass then 90 degree to the previous one, basically crisscrossing between the passes. That makes for the quickest sanding.
I think that was the 4th pass with 40 grit, and I'm happy enough with the surface and the defects that got sanded out. It's not that important because this is the underside of the tabletop, but now I can go to 60 grit, and that's also practice for the actual top.
The strategy keeps the same, doodling on my work and sanding it away.
I went up to 80 grit with the belt sander and also 1 pass with the random orbit sander just to get a feel how it is to sand on the floor in this big surface. Just for practice, not really necessary, it's just the underside. But then I flipped around to sand the top side, the same again, sanding with 40 grit on the belt sander, get out all the defects, and then go through the grits. A lot of sanding, oh.
After the 150 grit belt, I continued with the random orbit sander and went through 180 and 240 grit.
I now flip the tabletop around again and put the assembled base onto it. That's a whole video on its own, but I need that for the positions of the threaded inserts that I'll use to bolt the base to the tabletop. The base is centered on the tabletop and I can mark the position. These threaded inserts have M8 on the inside and N12 on the outside and will cut their own threads, so I don't need to pre-tap.
The live edge I first sanded with the angle grinder. That was the quickest way of getting rid of all the leftover bark. The other thing I did with it, we didn't want to keep the straight edges from cutting it off. We basically wanted more like a fake natural edge on the ends as well. And so I just randomly sanded on there until it pretty much looked like a live edge. That was quite fun actually. I then also rounded off the corners and then sanded with the random orbit sander and a soft pad by again marking the whole edge and sanding the marks away. I also created a round over this way, but only on the underside. For the top side, I only did this with the last sanding grit and by hand. There the round over should be much smaller.
And now it's done. Time for finish. I'm using an oil finish.
Applying this finish is extremely simple. Just put it on relatively thick, let the wood soak up whatever it can, and then wipe off the excess after 15 minutes. And only the first coat really drinks a lot of this finish. The other coats aren't as bad and you don't have to apply as much. After 1 night of curing, I then sanded the surfaces and the edges again and applied another coat. In total 3 coats on the bottom, 4 coats on the top. And I really like the result. It's an awesome finish. With the tabletop set in place, I then just had to find the screw positions or the threaded inserts and screw it in place. And then it was finished. I also have a video about making the table base with traditional wooden joinery. There's not a single piece of metal in it, and I'll have it linked in the video description.
I now have this on a piece of template material, and you can draw the shape of the grain onto that. The shape of the grain to the template material. Before running though, I have to prepare this piece with the jigsaw like I did here, like here, so that the shape is almost the shape of the template.